So again, some of the key skills related to leading change would be these: being resourceful and effective when things do change or when there's a stressful situation. Recognize that when something flutters over here, there might be an impact downstream, so kind of thinking about potential possible impacts. What about, we're in a change situation, it's a time to really think almost in a paradox. We've got fewer resources, fewer individuals maybe working here because we've had layoffs or whatever. How do we do things differently? How do we identify untapped resources, either internally or externally, that kind of thinking? And then also, what might the implications be, both for me, for the team, as things change? And so those are the kind of the related skills. What we're going to be doing is talking about behaviors that can increase your effectiveness under stress, in addition to what we just talked about. Because clearly in those situations, when you're under stress, your fears and faulty beliefs are just going to get exaggerated, right? Going to get heated up. So in addition to that, what are some strategies you can use when it is a stressful situation and you're feeling that stress? When people react to change, you can typically expect them to react in certain ways depending on the degree of change. We'll talk about that, continual versus more dramatic. And then there are some literally phases you can see people going through, including yourself, as you're responding to change. So we'll talk about those. And then we'll talk about a process for recognizing and having maximum impact in a changing situation, which is the model that I used in the Leader Synth article that you get called Throw Away the First 90 Days. So that, I call it the maximum impact model. You get the full model today. It's more of an abbreviated model in that white paper. All right. So as we talked about just in the first half of this, when you're someone who learns, responds effectively to situations, so kind of as an open learner is really effective at picking up on the cues and that sort of thing, you're going to be a more effective problem solver. People around you are going to turn to you, look to you to help be sort of that stable, solid anchor as things are changing. So part of it is not reacting, certainly not overreacting in situations, being more of a stable, consistent individual, as we talked about moments ago. But also it's having, you're kind of seeing the cup as half full, having more of an optimistic attitude. People respond well to a leader like that. So the more you can identify it and adopt that kind of attitude, the better off they're going to be, and also you will be. So what happens with change is, it used to be, I would say, when I was a kid, and certainly when I was in college even, people didn't talk much about change. It would be the seasonal change, it would be, maybe growing older, or, turning 16 or 21, or it's kind of these natural progressions, getting married, whatever, those kind of changes, and how that's going to change your life. But we never talked about change the way we talk about it now. Now it's like, the half-life of change. Things are shifting so quickly, technologically speaking, with the shifts that creates. So there's this focus on change. In fact, I was literally looking on, how many of you are part of LinkedIn as professionals? Yeah. And so that's the one social networking group that I'm a part of. And I literally was looking at some other groups I could be a part of, and there were ones on leadership, and I joined a couple of those, and there were a couple on some other things. There were a ton of them on change. Leading change, organizational development change, with the word change in them. I was surprised. It just didn't occur to me that many, and it was probably thousands of people altogether, were that interested and focused on change. And it's because there's so much of it going on, and kind of helping groups and teams and departments work through it, and organizations work through it, is really a critical skill. So some changes, if it's a gradual change, it's not such a big deal. If it's a discontinuous change, kind of like the 17 inches of snow we just got, that would be an example of a discontinuous change, where all of a sudden, boom, within a short amount of time, things happen in a very dramatic way. And then even though a place like Minneapolis is set up to take care of snow, you still see it piled high, and you can't walk on the sidewalks and everything else, because that was discontinuous change. That's the kind of change that creates stress for people, the more rapid, large-scale change. So that's what we're going to talk about mostly as we talk about it today, about change. So I want you to think about, I'm going to have you discuss amongst yourselves here in Paris, think about a recent change that your organization has undergone. Something that may have happened within the last several months. Maybe it's about to happen. Maybe it started happening a year ago, and it's still kind of chunking through, and things are happening. So most of you can think of at least one thing. And then think about, from what you've seen so far, both on your part and on the part of your team, your colleagues, what's the most typical reaction that you've seen from people? especially, it's kind of think about initially, how did people react? Did it start to shift over time? So I just want you to think about change. What do you think you've noticed about a recent change in your organization that you can share with somebody else? During your discussions, what were some of the themes that came out as you were talking to each other in terms of how people tend to respond to change, whether it changed over time or whether it's kind of stayed the same? What did you hear?
I think sometimes it's focusing on what's wrong with the change instead of focusing on the benefits of it.
Yeah, so the downside rather than the upside. Yeah, good observation. Charlie?
Well, when Tracy and I were talking, she was talking about just people that are kind of traditionally in different camps relative to change, or, some are positive, some are not so positive.
Yeah, so any kind of change, the same people often will be a little bit more resistant maybe, some people will be more positive, some people are kind of wait and see.
Some people do go with the flow.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. Get excited about it, go with the flow. Anything else just out of your discussion?
I think there's something to do with the longevity of how long that person's been ingrained in the current situation. So change is more uncomfortable for people who've been there.
Yeah, so the deeper the roots into the way it has been, that's a really good observation.
We talked about the loopholes that change, implementing new change closes that make people, adverse to the change.
Okay, so this would be the theme with Yolanda. So if people are accustomed to getting away with stuff and functioning in shades of gray or loopholes, and you tighten those things up, they feel squished. All right.
Well, they're just redirected more in a centralized theme rather than this gray, wandering path.
Right.
It exposes crooks.
It exposes crooks. And that also is true. It exposes crooks. All right, moving right along. Yeah, so what happens is people change over time. The changes that have an effect on them variably. They respond variably to the effects. And so it's actually kind of hard when you think about how to put that into some sort of a meaningful structure. What do you do with that? You just know people are going to react differently, and it doesn't give you much to work with. So that's where the structure hopefully will be helpful to you. And that is to talk about some of the phases in change. And you can literally see people begin to shift their perspective as they respond to change. So what happens is, as a leader, your job is to be the role model for change. So be able to lead change. And if you can successfully navigate the change and then helping your team successfully navigate it, you're going to have a more positive experience in responding to the change than departments who don't have a strong leader who really knows how to deal with change. So what happens is, and this is based on a model from William Bridges called Transitions. The book came out 20-some years ago. But the idea, the basic concept that he gave to the marketplace is that when change happens on the outside, it's not so much the outside change that happens that's the big deal, it's how we respond to it on the inside that's the big deal. So even if you think about the big snow, it wasn't so much the snow that was coming down, it's how you reacted to it, how it was impacting your life in one way or another, how it was going to impact your life. That's more where your response came. Because some people will look at that snow and they would say, terrific, I could go out skiing and kind of break my own path, or snowshoeing or something like that, or terrific, there won't be a lot of traffic on the streets and I can take my four-wheel drive Yukon and kind of drive wherever I want to go and there won't be hardly any traffic that'll get in the way. So there's all kinds of ways people could have responded to that, but it really is more based on the internal, how they think about things rather than the actual snow.
So don't you wonder, and this is like just change in general, but that's a really good example, because people kind of control their own destiny too. So if you're really adverse to snow and it really bothers you when it does snow, which it does in Minnesota, why would you continue to keep yourself in that environment rather than to move someplace that is a better fit for you?
Well, that's a good question too. So generalize that. If you're in a situation where things are changing rapidly, and one might say, well, like a technological company, for example, where that the technology is only going to last for so long, it's going to change dramatically. Or even in the news information business, information, Thomson Reuters information shifts dramatically, and the way you gather it and store it and whatever, if you can't handle change very effectively, then maybe you ought to start a bakery or do something where you have a certain way that you do things, you know, have certain hours, and people come back to you because your rolls and stuff always look, and cookies always look exactly the same, and don't introduce a lot of new stuff. So yeah, so part of it is identifying who you are with respect to change, and then thinking about how to avoid situations where it's so dramatic a change you're not going to be very comfortable. But most people don't have a lot of choice in that. Some people do choose to be a victim of that, the snow or change. And so it's not a very powerful place to be, but it's a choice. It's a choice you make. So what happens is, as things change, there's stages in the change, and there are distinct emotions and particulars about that change, and about people's reactions that I think is helpful to talk about. So we're going to talk about each one of them, and then give you a chance to do some discussing about that as well. So it takes a series of internal reframings on the inside, as things change on the outside. So let's talk about, do a brief introduction to the 4 stages. And to me, the analogy, I use the analogy of sort of like, reaching from one, you mind if I use your Barks can here? Sure you mind, or sure I can use it? I can use it, all right. So if this is the old, the Barks is the old. For me, this would be the old because it has caffeine in it, and I don't drink caffeine. So, you're holding on to the old way. This is the way it always was. Don't give me that look back there. This is the way it always was. All right, so we're going to hang on to this, and you're going to have to pry our fingers off of this, because we're always going to use this system. This is the system we know, and we're going to use it. Well, then those in power above us decide that they're going to change the system. Okay, so the first thing you have is people holding on to the old system, and they say things like, they're going to recognize what a bad decision this is after about 2 months. We're going to go back to this, so I'm not even going to learn the new system. I'm just going to kind of hang on to the old system. So that's the hanging on to the old, holding on. Then there's a point in time when you start to kind of let go a little bit. You start to loosen your grip just a little bit. That's the period that we'll talk about has the most fear and upset, because you're not sure what you're moving toward, but you're not going to be able to hang on to this can anymore. So the old can's not going to work. Then there's, the new thing is sort of reaching out towards something in this direction, and that's usually a time where there's the most creative energy and sort of think about how can we make this work, and envisioning, and still some fear and anxiety, and then there's the taking hold of the new direction, and then off you go. So people literally go through four phases of mental transition on the inside as they look at handling the change on the outside. So let's talk about each of those four, and that's the name. So hanging on is the first part. Letting go, so kind of loosening the fingers, is the second part. Reaching out is the third phase, and then taking hold of whatever that new system is the fourth one. So those are the 4 phases. Let's take a look at each one of those individually.